Good afternoon. My name is Hendrix Genetics, and I'd like to explain about broiler management. And broiler management, I have cut it up into two parts, part 1 and part 2, and this is the first one, so we'll call this part 1. And you do see here, so it's and I do it week by week. So we start as a small chick and until the very end. And although I do realize that what you see here are not broilers, but these are layers into an aviary system, but never mind that. So the first week of broiler production, that is still in the brooding phase, I cannot overemphasize that. That is really, really important, those first days, those first weeks. And the key word here is comfort. Just make sure that the chicks are as comfortable as possible. Any kind of stress will lead to less production. So you really want to make them comfortable. And that implies that you have to make sure that the feed, the water, the climate, even the light management, the rest, the healthcare, everything has to be in proper order. Make sure that life is as comfortable as possible, because after all, you are assuming the role of the hen, of the mother of the chicks, which is not there at the moment. Do realize that in this first week, the chicks already grow very fast. They may even get quadruple or get as 5 times as big, as heavy as they used to be when they hatched. So that's quite an achievement. And in order to do so, they must have first-class conditions, of course. Do realize that chicks, when they arrive, they are usually tired. So you have to give them some rest. Make sure they have plenty of good water available, preferably of the good temperature. Feed should be available. You really want, again, I'm coming back to the word, make sure their life is as comfortable as possible. And that means that you also have to make sure that everything is working properly. You don't want to do any repairs after the chicks have arrived. No, you want to do that before the chicks have arrived, and check that before the chicks have arrived that everything is fine. Usually they might be vaccinated at the hatchery, but if they're not vaccinated at the hatchery, before you release them, leave them in the crates they came in, and that is an excellent moment to vaccinate the chicks by spraying, for instance. Again, I'm coming back to the word comfort, because really you do realize that any kind of discomfort will cause stress to the animals. And if you have stress, that will lead to growth retardation. And obviously, when there's growth retardation, then the yield is much lower also. So you don't want that to happen. About temperature, realize that especially the first 5 days, but really the first 10 to 14 days, chicks are poikilothermic. That means they are not warm-blooded, they are not hot-blooded, the cold-blooded, they are somewhere in between. And the temperature will vary with the environment temperature. And chicks should be about 40 degrees Celsius. Initially, when the birds have arrived, and when they are tired, usually the temperature is a bit lower, but you want them to get them to 40 degrees as fast as possible. So you also want to check if the temperature is fine in your unit, and you do that by using a thermometer, and you measure the temperature at chick level. And once you have done that just before the chicks have arrived, after that really you don't need a thermometer anymore, because the chicks will tell you whether they are comfortable or not. Ensure that feed and water can be consumed easily and everywhere. Of course, there are standards like no more than 75 birds per feed plate, for instance, but really it's also about distance. How easy are they approaching water? How easy can they find feed? They should not be allowed. They should not have to walk too far to get what they need, really. And you can check that by feeding the crop about 8 hours after they have arrived, but also later you can check that, because after 8 hours already more than 80% of the chicks should have been eating. And after 1 day, nearly you should not be able to find more than 5% chicks which have not been eating. Nearly all of them must have been eating. And really, I would not feel comfortable to find any chick after 24 hours not having ate, then I really would be wondering what has happened and how can we improve that. Also, water, of course, even more essential than feed really, should be checked. And then we need to have a good water pressure. They should not have to walk too far to water. They should have, if you have a nipple system, the water droplet should be very visible. It should be at eye level or even at back level of the chicken, so that they really must be able to find water very easily. And then a challenging point is that we want it to be not too hot. And that is challenging because in the environment where chicks will be received, the temperature will be about 30 to 35 degrees even. But the ideal water temperature for chicks is about 24 degrees. So that means you have to refresh the water several times, or maybe flush the nipple lines several times to make sure that the water temperature does not exceed 30 degrees. It really will help the birds to drink more, and if they drink more, they will eat more, and if they eat more, they will feel more comfortable, and that's what you want, because that will yield to better results. Now here we have a picture of a chicken, and you see that chicken that has an infected yolk sac. And realize that if the birds are eating fast, that will stimulate the absorption of the residue yolk. So you want the birds to feed early, not only for the yolk sac resorption in the body, but also for the development of the intestinal system, of the digestive system, and even for the immune system. So early feeding is actually important. So if the yolk sac is not absorbed quickly enough, then this yolk sac might be infected, especially if the navel quality is not perfect. And then you get mortality, and that mortality often happens around day 3 or day 4. Often when you pick up these dead chicks at day 3 or 4, you smell them, you nearly can smell whether they haven't been dying of yolk sac infection. It has a very typical smell actually. Then here is a graph, and in this graph shows that after the weight you have realized after 7 days already is an indication for the weights to be received after 35 days. And you see that the heavier they are after 1 week, the heavier they will also be after 35 days. So that means if you make mistakes during the first week, whereby they are not growing so well, then also you will not be able to get the best results. And in here, the orange dots are for the males, and for the green dots are for the females, as you'll see, because the females tend to grow a bit slower than the males. Now, if I want that to realize, if I want to get birds to have a high weight after 1 week, then you also see that I have to feed them early. And the earlier you feed them, the earlier they are going to eat, the higher the weight will be after 1 week also. Pretty obvious. No surprise, I imagine. So that means that you have to make sure that all the conditions are first class right from the first day. Also, because in this graph it is shown that if there's a delay in feed intake after 1 day, already after 12 days you see a difference, and the delayed chickens generally do not catch up. So it's really essential that your birds are received in the best conditions and that they can eat as soon as possible, as soon as they want to. Now, in Europe we have a development that chicks may be fed immediately after hatching. And there are 2 ways of doing that. One way is simply by placing, and I'll move my picture away at the moment. One method is by feeding the chicks inside the hatcher, so in the machine, in the incubator. The birds hatch, and then immediately, as soon as they dry up, they can find feed already. So that is one method. Another method is the picture below. And in the picture below, and that is a small movie actually, is that, let me see if it is running now, not yet. Yeah. So this is what you see here is a movie which takes place around 24 hours. And what happens here is they have placed eggs inside the broiler unit, And those eggs, those hatching eggs, have been incubated already for about 18 days. So after 18 days, the eggs are transported from the hatchery to the poultry unit, to the broiler unit. In the broiler unit, the temperature is about 36, 37 degrees, and the eggs are left there to hatch. And then the moment the chicks are hatching, and you see that in this case it takes more than 24 hours between the first chicks and the last chicks. So the chicks who have been hatching first don't have to wait for the last chicks to feed. Now they can find feed and water immediately. So that is a development which is going on. I must admit it's not very popular yet because there are some disadvantages also, of course. But we do realize the importance of early feeding for the benefit, for the production of the broilers actually. Then what you also see is there are some signs of daily mortality pattern. And I mentioned already that the yolk sac infection usually happens around day 3 or 4 actually. Now, it is also related to the quality of the chicks. This is in both cases, in both graphs, you see a weak production. And then in the first graph, you see that especially in the last part of the first week, you have high mortality. And in the second graph, you see that especially in the first half of the week, we have high mortality. Now, it works like this in general, so it's not a law, but in general, if you have high mortality in the last part of the first week, usually it's a matter of poor management. So that you can only blame yourself in this case. Whereas if you have main mortality during the first part of the first week, then you might have to question also the quality of the broilers. And then you might have to question the hatchery to find out what kind of birds have to be given to you. Another thing is light. During the first week, I would like to give them some 3 hours of light, not 24, because I want them to get used to darkness as soon as possible. Because after that, I would like to reduce the light amount of light, the hours of light, to only about 18 or 20 hours of light. I know that in most countries, farmers are used to giving the chicks 24 hours of light, but there is some evidence that also chickens, also broilers, they benefit from a dark period of 4 to 6 hours. If you give them too much light, it will have a negative effect, like I mentioned here, on the growth rate, on feed intake, on mortality, even on processing performance, and of course, on broiler welfare. So for the first 3 parts are mainly important, I imagine, but those will determine technical results and of course economic results. So it's better to give them some light also, to give them some darkness also from about 4 to 6 hours. Now, in the second week, you will see that there will be further growth and development, and broilers will be still active, still quite active, alert, and rather noisy when you walk amongst them. After 2 weeks, they will not be so active anymore. They become lazy. They only get up when they are disturbed or when they are feeling like they want to drink some water or feed. For the rest of the time, they are quiet. Now, they should be well spread out in the unit. They should occupy the whole space. And if not, find out the reason, because now they are still small, but in a few weeks they will be very big, and then they have to occupy the unit. And if there are places in the unit which are not very comfortable for them, birds will be forced to sit on those non-ideal places, at which they will suffer and produce less. Now they are going to grow fast now. Daily gain accelerates because the skeleton has to be formed, the organs and the muscle mass especially has to be formed. And after a week or so, the broiler may eat already 20% of his own body weight every day. So we're putting a lot of stress on the intestines, on the digestive system already. And if they're growing too fast, it may even lead to sudden death. Usually it is associated later on in life, but also in the first weeks we might already observe a sudden death and especially susceptibility to diseases. And if you have suffering from that, what you could do is you could increase the dark hours, or try to ask your feed supply to give you feed which has less energy, which has a bit less protein also, to break in fact the fast growth. You may see some vent pasting. Usually, if it is limited to only about 5%, it doesn't have to be a big problem. But of course, if it is getting more and if it takes a longer time, then your birds will suffer from that. And like I mentioned before, in this week, you could increase the dark hours from 1 hour, giving them 23 hours of light, to about 4 hours. And in week 3, we're going to concentrate on the gut health and development. I said already that feed intake is rapidly increasing, and that means that also the intestines, the digestive system, is subject to a lot of stress for the animals. Do look for passive birds which are not very alert, because they may have some gut problems. It's a matter of observation is essential here throughout the rearing period, of course, of the broilers. So you might have to take a stool, might have to take a chair, sit down amongst them and observe them very carefully. You can also look at the droppings, because in the droppings you can learn a lot from the droppings. And the droppings which you can see here, if you examine them closely, you might find some undigested feed residues. And if you find undigested feed residues, but the feed you're providing them is of good quality, then you know something is wrong with the digestive system, for instance. So if you have droppings, fresh droppings, you should be able to roll them from one hand to another without your hands getting dirty. That is a good indication. If you have manure like that, then you have good quality. But not always is like that. You may also have more problem manure with more problems. Like in the right one, that is fine. In the middle one, it is reasonable. It looks to be a bit soft, although it is very difficult to judge from pictures. But from the right, you see that here we have a big problem already. These are not normal droppings, as you will all recognize, I imagine. So these are dropping from the intestines, but there are also droppings from the cecum, and they look quite different actually. So be aware that a chicken is producing two kinds of droppings. These ones usually in the morning. So in the right one, on the left hand side, you see the correct droppings, which look quite dark, although the color may differ. But in the second, you see some foam, which is usually not so good to observe. And in the consistency of the right one is very different, so that is also not so good. So there could be many reasons for that, of course. So here I have here some pictures, or a picture of droppings which have some red or pink matter. What happens here is that this is quite typical. Then the intestinal lining is damaged. This may happen maybe at the end of the production period also, when you're going to market the broilers and you don't feed them for several hours. If you don't feed them for several hours, then the intestinal lining will get loose from the intestines and will be pooped out. But also during production, you may also observe this, and then you know that you have some kind of intestinal problem. So here are various pictures, and you see the droppings of the uric acid. You see on the left, which may indicate that there is a kidney damage. In the second picture from the left, you see even green matter, and that is an indication that bile is in the droppings, which could be from kind of an infection, for instance, from Gumboro. There might be blood also, and then you need to be aware that when you see blood in the droppings, that when the droppings are still red, then the bleeding is mainly from the last part of the intestines. If the droppings appear very dark, very black, then there might also be blood, but then it's from an earlier part of the intestines. So then you have to think of coccidiosis, for instance. And then the last one is a droppings of a bird with enteritis, orange red mucus, and some blood. It looks a bit like a coccidiosis infection, but there might be more blood. Difficult to judge from just a picture, but you see that the droppings from the chicken can tell you a lot about the digestive system. Other droppings, dark droppings, I mentioned already, usually indication for blood in the intestines. Foamy colors could be from bacteria. And the third picture from the left, you see a lot of droppings and feed grains. And that means that if you see feed grains which are not digested, that means that you have a problem with the digestive system. Yeah. And the last part, you see maize, and maize is generally a very easily digestible feed source. So if you see maize in the droppings, undigested maize in the droppings, that means that you have a problem with the intestines, that the digestive system is not okay from the chicken. Then you can have feed additives, growth promoters, which are quite common worldwide, but and which have some advantages, especially if these are usually synonym for antibiotics, and they do help a lot. They do reduce risk of gut problems, and they will also enhance the feed conversion rate. That is all true, and they will also increase the final weight. So these are also all advantages, but do realize that using antibiotics in the feed may lead to resistant bacteria, and they will be banned from all countries. And maybe not yet in Bangladesh, but sooner or later, also in Bangladesh, you will have to stop using antibiotics if that is the common practice now. Fortunately, there are some alternatives, although I must admit, from what I've seen worldwide, antibiotics do work quite well actually, but we do have to get rid of that like we did in Europe also, and alternatives are available also, like there are organic and inorganic acids which work. There are essential oils from eucalyptus, from clove, oregano, pepper is used, and probiotics are also used. So there are some alternatives available instead of for the antibiotics. And besides prebiotics, probiotics, we also have prebiotics. Okay, that's an entirely different topic, which I'm not going to touch right now. Then another problem may be wet manure, and wet manure can be associated to Clostridium, and we need to look into that a bit more. What happens is there may be a change. It is because of a change in bacteria in the small intestine, and that is usually because there is some kind of disruption of normal conditions. For instance, a pH increase, so a pH higher than 7 might be the cause, although also stress sometimes or poor management may be related to that. And then the bacteria, they spread from the lower part of the intestines to the higher part of the intestines, and thereby disturbing the normal bacterial balance. Now, the disruption it may also be is often due to coccidiosis, or a change in feed, or poorly digestible feed, or problem with feed supply, but also with problems with the house climate. And like I said, any other stress factor might also be associated with this problem. You can see that by the droppings, and then you get very wet droppings, or if the chicks are very young and they're walking on paper, then you see this very large wet area on the paper, and that is an indication that there could be some problem with this bacteriosis. When you are changing from one feed to another, you have to be careful because birds, they have to get adjusted. That digestive system has to get adjusted like that. And problems may appear just a few days. So if you often experience problems like that, it's good to do the feed transfer from a starter to a grower feed or for a grower to a finisher feed very gradually. And if you have perfect management, that reduces the risk enormously. Do realize that chickens prefer larger particles. Yeah, often I see that in many countries, the mesh which is being provided to chicken has smaller particles, but broilers are usually fed with crumbs or with pellets, but they do like the larger particles. They don't like to eat the smaller particles. So that means that if your birds are, if there is a lot of dust in your pellets, the chicks won't like to eat the dust from the pellets. But in the dust, there might be especially the vitamins, the trace minerals, and especially those smaller particles. So you do want your feed company to produce a good quality pellet, including all the minerals. Well, finally, a small trick if you're worried about gut health and development. Here we have two pictures of two pictures of somebody catching a chicken, and then in the first picture, on the left, you see that the chicken is hanging with the feet down. Usually when you pick up a chicken, and initially the feet goes up to the stomach, but after a few seconds the feet go down. If the chicken, like in the picture on the right, keep their feet up, it usually is an indication that they have some kind of intestinal problem. So that's a small trick which you can change, which you can try to assess whether the birds have problems or not. So that is to detect stomach pain. Thank you. My next presentation will be from week 4 onwards. Thank you very much for listening to me.